The recent release of the iPhone 16e was about more than just an iPhone. It revealed an all-new chip inside an iPhone, which is the Apple C1. But it's not just an in-house chip, it's Apple dropping a major manufacturer in Qualcomm. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the release of the Apple C1, including its background and reasoning, technical aspects, its impact, and some thoughts on the future. Okay, so for context, Apple used Qualcomm modems in iPhones as early as the original iPhone back in 2007. Intel also had a part to play here, as some Intel modems were used occasionally in iPhones. Examples include the iPhone 7 series, the iPhone 8 series, the iPhone 10 series, the iPhone XS series, and the iPhone 11 series. But Qualcomm had a much larger role to play here, especially outside of the examples I just gave. So from the iPhone 12 series and later, Apple switched back to Qualcomm modems. Fast forward to this day, the entire iPhone 16 lineup relied on a Qualcomm modem until the release of the iPhone 16e, which is the first and currently the only iPhone not to include a Qualcomm modem. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Apple bought Intel's modem division back in 2019. Ever since then, Apple put in more and more effort to produce a solution that would allow it to separate itself from Qualcomm in the modem space. And after years of work, their efforts finally paid off with the Apple C1. Qualcomm now expects to retain only 20% of Apple's modem business for iPhone launches in 2026 and 0% in 2027. So what that means is that by 2027, Qualcomm expects that Apple will have separated itself from it completely in this space. But now that we know that Apple is moving away from Qualcomm in favor of its own modems, why is Apple doing this? Why is Apple choosing to go with an in-house solution rather than to stick with a reliable manufacturer that it had a relationship with for years? Well, actually, there are multiple reasons for this. There have been lawsuits between the two companies between 2017 and 2019, but these were only a minor inconvenience to their long-term relationship because Apple and Qualcomm continued working together to get Qualcomm modems integrated into iPhones after those lawsuits were settled. But the lawsuits reflected a deeper problem for Apple. Apple's concern was that it was simply paying way too much to Qualcomm for these modems. As iPhone sales skyrocketed, so did the royalty payments. It was estimated that Apple paid over $2.5 billion in 2024 alone for Qualcomm's patent licenses. Now let's talk a bit about the Apple C1's engineering and technical aspects. Its baseband modem is manufactured using 4nm technology, while its transceiver uses 7nm. But interestingly, there is no millimeter wave support, which is the fastest 5G standard. Now, the main argument that is sort of circulating to suggest that no millimeter wave support in the Apple C1 is okay for now is that millimeter wave has limited range and isn't widely used around the world yet. But how does the Apple C1 compare to what Qualcomm has to offer? To gain a general idea, we can simply take a look at the modem that is included in the rest of the iPhone 16 lineup, so the standard 16 and 16 Plus as well as the 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max. Now, all of these devices include the same Qualcomm Snapdragon X71 5G modem, which, unlike the Apple C1 in the iPhone 16e, does actually have millimeter wave support. So theoretically, in an optimal environment where top speeds can be achieved, the Snapdragon X71 5G should achieve higher download and upload speeds than the C1. But under a more realistic comparison where we don't have the advantage of the millimeter wave standard, which once again isn't widely used yet, we see that the iPhone 16e with its Apple C1 is actually able to achieve higher speeds than the rest of the iPhone 16 lineup that is equipped with the Snapdragon X71 5G. So at least for now, you can probably argue that this gives the iPhone 16e and the Apple C1 a bit of an edge. Another technical aspect about the Apple C1 is its efficiency. This is something that Apple has definitely emphasized quite a bit when it announced the iPhone 16e. Specifically, Apple said that the C1 is 25% more power efficient than previous modems, and combined with a rather larger battery. Fun fact, the battery in the iPhone 16e has more capacity than the battery in the iPhone 12 Pro Max, which is a much larger phone with a much larger display. This translates into more battery life, which is also a good thing for the iPhone 16e. So what does this mean for Apple? Aside from the C1 being the start of significant cost savings for Apple, the C1 is a big step towards increased control over the components of Apple devices. Apple has historically integrated components from other manufacturers into its devices, including processors by Samsung and Intel, cameras by Sony, and modems by Intel and Qualcomm. But we have been seeing Apple transitioning away from some of those manufacturers towards its own in-house components. So the shift away from Samsung processors in iPhones, the shift away from Intel processors in Mac devices, and the most recent one, which is the shift away from Qualcomm modems. From Apple's perspective, the more control you have over the components of your devices, the better it is for you. This is for a number of reasons. First, there is the potential for greater harmony between software and hardware. Because you have complete control over the design and the engineering of the component, in this case the C1, you can integrate it much more effectively into the environment that it's supposed to operate in. This would also allow for benefits that may not have been achievable with a non-Apple modem, like greater power efficiency. This ties with the second reason, which is the Apple user experience. Over the years, Apple was able to improve the overall user experience by focusing on different areas, like more capable software, an ecosystem that connects all your Apple devices, and of course, superior hardware quality. The latter category is where the Apple C1 falls, which means that it should help Apple offer an improved user experience consistent with their standards. Qualcomm, on the other hand, are likely going to be in a more difficult position. There are three important aspects to this. The first one is obviously the big financial loss that will eventually come from Apple no longer being a customer of Qualcomm. Once again, this is important because we've seen how much money Qualcomm makes from Apple. It's certainly going to be interesting to see how Qualcomm plans to bounce back from that. This ties with the second aspect, which is Qualcomm's reputation. Losing Apple is not just a financial loss for Qualcomm, it can also potentially be a hit to Qualcomm's reputation. When you're a company operating at a high scale like Qualcomm and you serve big customers like Apple, losing one of your biggest customers might raise concerns that may deter future customers from signing with you. Of course, it's not just about reputation, it's also about quality, and we know that Qualcomm are capable of producing good quality components, so this risk may or may not materialize. This brings us to the third aspect. Not only is Apple no longer a Qualcomm customer, but they have in a way become a competitor. Apple could have switched to a different modem manufacturer, but the fact that they now produce their own modems in-house technically means that they are now a competitor. Not a direct one because you won't find Apple modems in non-Apple devices, but technically still an indirect competitor because sometimes it's a specific part of a device that encourages customers to buy it. If Apple is able to create a big difference between its own modems and those of Qualcomm's, who knows? Maybe that might draw some people towards Apple devices rather than devices that include a Qualcomm modem. One thing is certain, it'll definitely be very interesting to see how things will unfold for Qualcomm in the next few years. But more importantly, what does all of this mean for us as customers? We've already mentioned the potential to improve the user experience earlier in the video, but the Apple C1 may bring about more benefits. A good example of this would be the potential for lower prices. We mentioned earlier that the C1 is the start of significant cost savings for Apple, and so this comes with Apple no longer having to pay huge amounts of money to Qualcomm. So we could potentially see some slightly lower iPhone prices after 2027, so after the point where Apple is no longer relying on Qualcomm modems. Since Apple is now able to produce their own modems, does that mean we might see other companies switch from third-party manufacturers and join Apple in manufacturing their own modems? Take Google and OnePlus for instance. The Pixel 9 lineup uses the Samsung Exynos 5400, and the OnePlus 13 uses the Qualcomm Snapdragon X85G. Could we potentially see these companies develop their own modems and drop their respective suppliers at some point in the future? And since Apple now has greater control over the components of its devices, what might be next for it? It seems like the focus for now is to work on the next iteration of the C series, which would likely be called the Apple C2. This would allow Apple to truly catch up and properly compete with the main modem manufacturers around, especially Qualcomm. So what might this look like at this stage? There has been some talk that Apple might try to integrate its future modems into the SoC. So right now, the Apple C1 in the iPhone 16e is a separate chip that is outside of the A18 SoC. But if future Apple modems are integrated into future SoCs, we might see some benefits, like faster data communication, lower power consumption, and a bit more space inside the device, which could possibly provide room for a slightly larger battery. Another area is millimeter wave support. This seems like a key area to focus on because of its importance in the long term. So even though millimeter wave has limited range and isn't widely used around the world yet, that doesn't mean that it will always be like this. It's only a matter of time before this standard eventually gets more support and greater coverage within countries where it's available, not to mention supporting millimeter wave in countries where it's not even supported yet. So not that much of a concern for Apple in the short term, but likely a crucial goal in the long term. But what do you think about the Apple C1? Do you think this was a good move from Apple? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like, share and subscribe. And feel free to let me know in the comments if there is anything tech you're interested in and want me to make a video about. In the next video, I'll be taking a bit of a trip to the past. as I'll be covering what using the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus in 2025 is like. Make sure to tune in for that because it's going to be very interesting. Also, please consider supporting me by donating to my channel through buymeacoffee.com. I would really appreciate any support as I continue to bring fun and interesting content like this. Only if you can, of course. Link down below. This was the Wizard of Tech, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.